Australia Day has supposedly become controversial, attracting activists who seem to want to call it Invasion Day. But it appears that small number of activists isn't actually achieving anything. In shocking news, it turns out that people don't like being yelled at, or harangued, or forced into conformity. Because it turns out the support for Australia Day seems to have actually increased year on year. This is despite of, or probably because of, the voice referendum and all of the protests. People just seem to be sick of it at the moment. This finding comes to us courtesy of Roy Morgan. Roy Morgan is an established pollster, not a right-wing think tank, a pollster that polls on myriad other things. It is reasonably well respected, at least as far as pollsters go. If anything, they seem to lean a little bit progressive. So Roy Morgan surveyed 1,000 people about what they think about Australia Day, whether they think that the date should be moved or the name should be changed. So here are some of their key findings. First, they asked, on January 26, 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip landed at Sydney Cove. In your opinion, should January 26th be known as Australia Day or Invasion Day? Now this question is not exactly brilliant. Some people might not like the name Australia Day, but they might think Invasion Day is a little bit too on the nose. And simply might get people thinking the other way. They might not really like Australia Day, and therefore they vote for Invasion Day, but don't really like that either. It's a little bit narrowly worded, but nevertheless it gives us some insight. Now in January 2021, only 59% of people thought it should be called Australia Day. In 2022, that rose to 65%. It then dipped marginally to 64% in 2023. However, in 2024, 68.5% of people surveyed thought that the date should be called Australia Day. Support for Australia Day has increased over time, despite of, or because of, the voice referendum and all of the activists. It appears the activists have been backfiring on their own goals. Now, if we look at who exactly is supporting Australia Day, we can see some slightly interesting findings. For example, support is strong with men. 76.5% of all men support Australia Day, at least of those surveyed. 61.5% of women also support it, so it has a majority across both men and women. Furthermore, a majority in all age groups supported calling it Australia Day, although support was highest amongst older age groups. Nevertheless, even amongst younger age groups, there was majority support for it being called Australia Day. Furthermore, people in both cities and the country supported Australia Day. This held across all states. Support was lowest in Victoria at 63.5% support, but even in Victoria, there was majority support for calling it Australia Day. That is, there was no support anywhere for calling it Invasion Day. In short, there's no majority support in any of these groups for the name to be changed. Therefore, we should stop pretending there's some groundswell of support or some majority support to change the name of the day, or to think of it as Invasion Day. There simply isn't majority support, despite what some of the activists and some of the marchers seem to want to have you believe. Now, if we look at this by party affiliation, only the Greens seem to support as a majority it being called Invasion Day. 90% of coalition voters wanted to be called Australia Day. About half of Labour voters also think so. However, the Greens don't get to decide what we call the day. Furthermore, ALP only attracted about 30% of the primary vote at the last election. So even if we're looking at the ALP, they don't have a majority either. That is, overall, the majority of Australians wanted to be called Australia Day, not Invasion Day, and they don't seem to think of it as such. Therefore, we should stop pretending that people do want the day to be changed or to be renamed, despite what the ABC might want to have you believe. Roy Morgan then asked, should we move the date of Australia Day? Now, moving the date got a little bit more support, and one could in theory move it to, say, for example, the day that the Australia Acts came into force. However, as I've indicated before in prior videos, as soon as you move the day, you have appeased the activists, and then they just move on to the next thing that they demand. Moving the date could set a dangerous precedent. It's better to hold your ground now. Even if you were generally indifferent toward what the date should be, you want to avoid the activists asking for yet ever more. Now, if we're looking at moving the date, this of course is a little bit challenging, because the question didn't ask about the counterfactual. It didn't ask what the other date should be. For example, presumably there might be different levels of support for the 1st of January versus some other day in the second half of the year, etc., etc. Therefore, what day we change it to is also going to influence the result. But nevertheless, the results are a little bit interesting. Here, 58.5% of people aged over 18 think that the date should not be moved. Support for the 26th of January is higher in older age groups, which is relatively unsurprising given the foregoing results. However, moving the date does not have majority support in any age group. Only 32.5% of men want to move the date. However, 50.5% of women do support moving the date. That, however, is within the margin of error, so it's not totally clear exactly how strong that majority support is. Nevertheless, overall, the majority of Australians do not want to move the date. If you look at it by location, for some odd reason, 50.5% of people in Western Australia support moving the date. That, of course, is a little bit odd, because if we look at the other results for Western Australia, 71% of the people in WA supported calling it Australia Day. So it's not totally clear why we got the reversal. However, no other state wants to move the date, or at least not a majority of people in any other state want to move the date. Unsurprisingly, if we look at it by party affiliation, 94% of Green supporters want to move the date. That, of course, should be relatively unsurprising given all of the activism that the Greens seem to be going through, and given that the Greens also seem to support calling it Invasion Day. 61% of ALP supporters want to move the date, however, only 18.5% of coalition voters want to move the date, and therefore it lacks majority support to move the date. Now, of course, this poll has some caveats. They only surveyed 1,000 people. Clearly, this means that in some of the subsamples, you might have relatively few people, especially if you start trying to dig into exactly who is in these subsamples. For example, say we're looking at Western Australia, how is that made up of men and women, and how is that made up across party lines? And if it's made up across equal representation across party lines, do you have only, say for example, 2 Greens voters in WA who happen to be women? In which case, you're going to end up with some slight outliers in the results. Nevertheless, it is informative, and all polls have those caveats. All polls have the caveats of which exact subsamples go into it. However, we can see that a majority of Australians do not want to move the date, and a majority of Australians support calling it Australia Day. And this is telling because support has increased over time. Only a minority of people seem to dislike Australia Day. Only a minority of people want to move the date or change the name. It is as if all of the vitriolic shouting from the activists has had the opposite effect. Going around and telling people that it's misinformation that sunk the voice appears to have backfired. Going around and gaslighting people and obfuscating and haranguing people seems to have backfired. People don't seem to have any time for the activists anymore. People are sick of it. They're sick of being commanded to think a particular thing, or being commanded to do a particular thing, and being attacked if they happen to fall out of line. This, for example, is why we saw that The Voice failed miserably. It's why we saw that 60% of Australians rejected it, and it failed in every single state. We saw it fail, at least in part, because of how the whole campaign was run. And the same issue permeates throughout the Australia Day debate. People are sick of the activists. They don't like the marches. They don't like all of the attacks. They don't like being called a particular name if they happen to support Australia Day. They don't like Australia Day being painted as controversial or somehow problematic, to use the word that has now become en vogue. In essence, people are just tired of this. And a majority of Australians want to celebrate Australia Day, they want to be able to get on with their lives, and they want to call it Australia Day and celebrate Australia for what it is and for all of its accomplishments. Nevertheless, do let me know your thoughts about this polling and your thoughts about Australia Day in the comments below.